Good morning, everyone. Welcome to History is Lunch here in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you've not already, please silence your cell phones. Don't forget that this evening at 6:30 we'll be hosting a free preview of the new Ken Burns country music documentary in this space that will feature a 35-minute segment on the singing brakeman Jimmy Rogers and a special appearance by Grammy-winning Louisville, Mississippi singer-songwriter Carl Jackson. All the tickets have been claimed, but I'm going to treat it like church. You show up and we will do our best to find a spot for you. You can tell them Elbert Hilliard told you that was the way to go. Tomorrow evening, from 5 to 7 p.m. at the Eudora Welty House and Garden, National Book Award finalist Taya Obrecht, author of The Tiger's Wife, will be signing copies of her latest novel, Inland. That's co-sponsored, of course, with our friends Lemuria Books, and we invite you all to that. And then on Saturday, we'll offer a beginning genealogy workshop led by Curator of Research and Genealogy Joyce Dixon Lawson. The program will begin here in the Nielsen Auditorium, then move next door to the Winter Building. The cost of the workshop is $10. You can check the MDH website for registration information, but we are certainly happy just to have you show up and take part the day of. You do not need to register in advance. Finally, I hope that you will join us next week for History's Lunch when Jeff Mansell will present the History Minute, Mississippi Stories in Video. Today, we are delighted to have Christopher Hunter to present African American Church Houses of Mississippi, 1800 to 1920s. Hunter was born in Dayton, Ohio, and he holds a Bachelor of Architecture degree from the University of Cincinnati and a Master's and PhD in Architecture from Texas A&M University. Hunter is an assistant professor of architecture at Mississippi State University, where he teaches various design studios and lectures on the history of architecture from the late 18th century to the present. He serves on the Historic Preservation Committee for the city of Starkville and is leading an effort in the MSU Architecture School to create a Historic Preservation Certificate program for students interested in a more intense study of the academic and professional aspects of historic preservation, which of course delights us no end. Help me welcome Chris Hunter.
Thank you, Chris, and I want to thank the Mississippi Department of Archives and History for inviting me down. Looking forward to this. And before I get started, I wanted to take a moment here to thank the person that has allowed me to do this research and this study on history here for the last 6 or so years, my lovely wife, Pamela Hunter, who's in the back, taking pictures. And so thank you, sweetheart, for letting me do this. Okay, make sure everything is working. Are we working here? Do I have it off?
Let's see.
Oh, there we go. Oh. Okay, great. Okay. If you Googled the words "the Black Church" or words to that effect, and go online and pull up whatever Google presents, you will likely find a ton of information about two things: either the people or the events that typically would surround the civil rights movement. Things like Dr. King speaking here during the height of the civil rights movement, the bombing of the aftermath of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, and the paper presenting the tragedy there back in 1963. Almost never, and I can't say never, but almost never will you find any information about the actual buildings, the actual church houses that housed the people, hosted the events. There is a duality here that I see between the study of these church buildings in two disciplines: American architecture and American history. These concentric circles, as we drill down, can get smaller and smaller with the focus on architectural history here and African American history in the lower circle. Drilling down a little bit further, architectural history can, as a subset, get drilled down even further to sacred architecture, and African American history can be subsetted out to include the institution of the Black church. Until we get to the overlap. the African American church buildings, which I see is a subject, an object here that actually can overlap between these two disciplines. My research, and I wrote my PhD on this topic here, but my research basically focuses on these 3 points here. The study of church buildings which continue to function as churches to this very day. Churches located on historically black colleges and black college and university campuses, and church buildings which no longer exist. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the church congregation doesn't exist. There's a split there, but this is more focused on whether the church building itself continues to stand. So, how do we get here? The Negro Church is the only social institution of the Negroes which started in the African forest and survived slavery under the leadership of priests or medicine men. Afterward of the Christian pastor, the church preserved itself the remnants of African tribal life and became, after emancipation, the center of Negro social life. So that today, the Negro population of the United States is virtually divided into church congregations which are real units of race life. This was a point that was made at the Atlanta conference of Negro problems that took place in 1898. That conference basically focused on almost a singular point here of attempting to determine at that time what the Negro problem in America is. We're coming out of the Civil War, we're coming out of Reconstruction, and we are now in a situation where we're in the late 1890s where Jim Crow is beginning to take root. The so-called Southern traditions are beginning to take root at this particular time, and yet we still have former enslaved people and their descendants that are now rolling into the 20th century. And so this became an issue that was studied by Dr. Du Bois, who wrote this book on the Negro Church. That book was published in 1903. It got very little traction academically. Today, I think I made references to it in my dissertation, I don't know how many times, but back then he wrote about the issues specifically of the Negro Church. And in that book, he chronicled everything that existed in 1903, everything that he could possibly chronicle. The number of churches, the number of institutions, the number of black people across the country that were members of these churches. This kind of work had never been done before. It got very little traction back then because the question then became, well, who cares? What's the relevance here of tracking this information? But as part of his research, he stated that nature worship was part of our historical and cultural beliefs even before the transatlantic slave trade occurred. So the tie back to African culture, Afrocentric culture, was established by Dr. Du Bois and his research, which takes us to this. This is a map of the slave trade golden triangle. The pink colors, the pink colors here represent those generally speaking, those portions of the continent of Africa where the vast majorities of Africans were taken and imported, as you see through the travel green lines here, over to South America, specifically in Brazil, the Caribbean, and then this portion of North America. This occurred over 250 some odd years, okay, where over 11 million Africans were taken from the continent. Oddly enough, less than 500,000 actually came to the shores of what is now the United States. But it didn't stop there. A domestic slave trade was established within our shores. So there were so-called ports of call, if you will, that existed here from New York, yes, New York, Baltimore, all the way down the coast, Norfolk, Wilmington, Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, and Galveston. From those points, domestic slave trading occurred all across the southern portion of the United States. So it didn't stop once the boats actually hit the shore. This is relevant because this ultimately establishes the locations of where Africans and their descendants would eventually begin to settle. Now, while Africans were brought here, a process that actually started in some cases on the African shores called seasoning occurred, where the goal of that effort was a very simple one. Beat the the humanity out the person and turn the person into a slave. Sometimes that process would occur months on end before those African individuals actually left the continent. They get here, and here, nothing has really changed from a humanity standpoint. They're still husbands, wives, mothers, fathers, people. They brought their culture, they brought their beliefs, they brought all this over here to the Americas, and specifically to North America. But the institution of slavery was so precise and so succinct that you didn't need, at least in the United States, you didn't need more than 500,000 people to apply the influence of the institution onto these individuals and their descendants. So when they moved forward, with one generation after the next, a process called syncretization began to occur. These people know of their own histories, their own beliefs, their own culture. Now this someone called Jesus is brought into their world, and they're trying to figure out what's going on with Christianity, what's going on with Jesus. He seems to be going through the same kind of problems that we're going through. They're trying to figure out how to syncretize or blend their African beliefs and cultures with Christianity. They figured it out, okay? Through secret meetings in places like gullies and swamps and even some barns that were basically on the down low. These places called hush harbors were established where they could express themselves, attempting to syncretize their own African beliefs and their own Christian beliefs. From this action was born the context that we see now in black churches, the balance between an African presence, an African cultural presence, and the understanding and beliefs of Christianity. The challenge here was they wanted to ensure that the slave owners didn't know what they were doing, because there was a very strong commitment here, and in some cases, a very obvious one, where the enslaved people went to church with their slave owners, sat in the balconies, sat in the back, or a priest or a pastor or a preacher will come to the plantation and will consistently beat into their heads certain passages out of the Bible. Don't steal from your master. Be a good worker, and one day you will get your just reward in heaven. So they're hearing this over and over and over again, and I think anybody would probably agree that that's not what I want to hear. So when they're trying to blend their culture with Christianity, they do this in a manner that's more celebratory, that is more committed to what and how they want to believe and their own interpretation of what Christianity is, which obviously comes into conflict with what they are consistently being exposed to. However, by the start of the Civil War, around 1861, we have about 4 million African Americans living in this country. And by generation from the first Africans that stepped off the boat at these ports here, we begin to lose a little bit of that connection back towards the African continent, because the generations are being born and they're moving away from that particular source, that man or that woman that was on that boat that can talk to them and teach them and pass on African traditions. In other words, they're now African Americans. They were then, we are now. There is no change here, and the evangelization of these generations of African Americans was a lot easier to do in the middle of the 19th century, because they had no direct relationship, no direct tie to Africa. After the Civil War, after Reconstruction, we started doing it for ourselves. Now, all of a sudden, churches are organized across the South, because we are now free to do so. We don't have to hide in the swamps anymore to do this. So now the creation and organization of church congregations, whether the building exists or not, occurs around this time, and it continues on into the early part of the 20th century. And what follows will be the construction of the actual buildings. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about individuals and their descendants that knew how to put a building together. They knew how to build. They knew how to construct structures, cut wood, form bricks. They knew how to do all that. They just were not able to do it for themselves. Now we're in a situation here where we're moving into the latter part of the 19th century where they're able to do it. And for a brief period of time, mainly Reconstruction, there was a glimmer of light here that African Americans were under the belief that things were going to get better for themselves until Reconstruction ended. So moving into the 20th century, we now find ourselves in a situation where the church structure is actually up. Okay, they are constructed. And we have a place that we call our own, that we call our home. And as time moved on into the first half of the 20th century, the last vestiges of segregation, of Jim Crow, of the old traditional South is basically taking its last stand by the time the start of the Civil Rights Movement occurs in the late 1940s, moves into the 50s and into the 60s. The church houses become more than just places to worship. They were homes for political, educational, social, economic progress moving forward. They were our homes. They were our safe harbors. Today, the African church house, I would argue, is the only building type in this country that was established by and for African Americans. Now, let's get this nailed down to church houses in the state of Mississippi. This is a map of the slave population from 1850, county by county through the old Confederacy. The darker the county, the more populous, the more populated it was with enslaved people. Again, this is 1850. You see the state of Mississippi carved out there. The yellow dots represent the churches that I'm going to present to you today. This may be a simple correlation here, but it's one that to my knowledge, hasn't been done. You see where the slave populations and eventually the freed persons populations exist along the river. Okay, many of the churches that I looked at here in this study are sitting in, near, or close to the Mississippi River. We got one down here on the Gulf and one here in Meridian. But basically speaking, the conclusion here is if this county has more black people in it, chances are pretty good you're going to see some kind of an enclave, a freedman town, a church. Now, the Civil Rights Movement, brought attention to these buildings, all right, simply because of the activities that occurred within them. But there was a dichotomy that existed not only just in Mississippi, but throughout the South. The Old South taking its last stand versus the inevitable wave of change that would eventually come in the 1950s and 1960s. And as you all know, we were at loggerheads on this. But the churches were turned, like I mentioned before, into the safe harbors, the places where the activities occurred, the planning occurred, and this wound up being the first tangible expression, from my opinion, first tangible expression of material culture for African Americans that was actually constructed. Now, from the Delta to the coast, we are basically looking at a specific kind of architecture that exists in Mississippi, at least from what I found in my research. And when I wrote my dissertation, I studied 6 churches across the entire South. And 2 in Texas, one here in Mississippi, which is my flagship church that you'll see in a minute, one in New Orleans, one in Alabama, and then one in South Carolina. So it's a pretty broad swath from a regional perspective of the study that I conducted here. But in Mississippi specifically, there were several styles that were very consistent and unique. Unique in the context that they occurred over and over and over again. Greek Revival architecture, Romanesque style architecture, and Greek and Gothic Revival. For some reason, and I'm trying to close in on exactly what that reason may be, these styles were pretty apparent and pretty consistent in the application and construction of many of these churches, whether they were rural or whether they were urban. In this state. And I don't know if I've ever seen this kind of consistent application of an architectural style on black churches in any other state throughout the South. Today, these churches, many of them are landmark status churches. Most of the churches that you're going to be presented to are recognized by the state of Mississippi, simply because of the historical contribution that they made from a cultural perspective and from an American history perspective. But there's also an architectural perspective as well. The challenge here from a research standpoint is that not a lot of information from a socio-cultural perspective has been documented about the evolution of these buildings. That's where my research comes in. Why did Greek revival take hold or Gothic revival take hold with African Americans when they were constructing these buildings here in the state of Mississippi and alike? So my research position and my academic niche, if you will, is you can't just tell the stories about the people and the events. There was a place, there was a home, there was a constructed building that these things occurred. That building is just as important, or has to be just as important, as the individuals who constructed it and their lives and the lives that it hosted. So that being said, we'll start with my flagship church, Jackson Street Missionary Baptist Church. This is in Vicksburg. This is probably one of the finest examples of Gothic revival architecture, and some of the qualities of this type of architecture that exists will be, from a formal standpoint, a very strong, obvious tower. It could be one tower, it could be two, okay? A very strong frontal facade. Details about the heads of the windows, pointed arches, not unlike medieval and Gothic architecture from Europe that you would see. Buttresses here, masonry buttresses that provide a structural support for the walls as well as the tower. As a matter of fact, when I first looked at this building and saw this crenellation up here, I started thinking, well, is it really Gothic revival? This looks like a touch of Norman architecture, defensive architecture, where some guy up here with a cannon or some oil or some rocks are on fire. Like, get away from my church. So I thought, but then as you'll see, this kind of detailing is, again, just as consistent as the fact that the tower exists on the facade as part of the architectural expression. This picture I took in 2017. This picture I did not take. This is 1908. This is the church as it was, as it looked back then. The only difference here is that the construction of the tower is underway here. And the only difference that I could see between here and here is this canopy has been added. Everything else is the same. It has not changed it literally has not changed in over 100 years. So as I mentioned, there are details here, and some of the architectural qualities that we see in the expression of this particular style takes really interesting forms in the cross that you see here. Again, the buttresses that are illustrated here, that are constructed here. We get a little bit closer. This church had a couple of towers on it. The towers don't necessarily have to be the same. They don't have to be the same size. They don't have to be the same proportion. They just have to exist. In this particular case, this tower at one point was an exit, an emergency exit, in which the doors are still there. But you see this hole here and a companion hole over here. There was a wrought iron stair that once existed on the side of the church, and they've since removed it. But in just about every one of these churches, the main sanctuary is elevated off the ground. So you have to go upstairs to get to the main sanctuary anyway. Some more detailed shots here of the head conditions, brickwork, as well as the sill conditions that you see here. These are the original windows for this church. On the sides, the longitudinal elevations, you see a framework, an aesthetic framework that's created here with a corbelling of the brick that you see here. Basically, the stepping up or stepping out from one plane of brick here to another plane of brick here. In this case, there are 5 bays here that were expressed equally with the manner in which the windows in the sanctuary were constructed and aesthetically expressed, with what's going on here on the lower level, the fellowship hall, where the heads of these windows take another expression. This was at one time a window until they popped the window out and put the doors in. The aesthetic turns to the rear of the church, so we've got these buttresses strengthening up the corners here and all the way across. And these churches, all these churches are bearing load-bearing structures. So the walls are made of solid bricks, and the walls the details referred to as a wife, a wall that has constructed of bricks, and there's a wall of brick followed by another wall of brick, followed by another wall of brick, followed by another wall of brick. Okay, so you have a very thick structure here that is strong enough to carry wood framing that is necessary to frame not only the floors, but the roofs of these structures. This is the interior shot of the altar of the church. It's a pretty vast and pretty open church. I was told by the congregants that a portion of the movie Mississippi Burning was filmed here back in I think the movie came out in 1988. The furniture here, the pews are not original to the structure. You'll find, or I have found, as time has gone on, that a number of interior changes have been made to many of these churches as we move forward in time. So things like the introduction of carpet, it was not part of the original sanctuary design, or the pews was not original to the church. This is the balcony space, which I don't think they actually use anymore. I'm not entirely sure. But these are the original pews in the balcony, the original seating in the pews in the balcony. So as you can see, there is no carpeting here, and these are this is the balcony area that tears up from the front to the back. And pretty simple seating here. Even a little bit of detail here as far as the framework for the chair. We go down to the basement, the fellowship hall. These are original columns. These are solid brick, okay, and they sit on concrete, which disperses the load down into the ground. So when we're building these structures, and we have perimeter walls in which we have 4 brick walls that create the one assembly here, that load is carrying the framing for the floors, the framing for the roof, from the top of the building down into the ground. And there is a typical 19th century detail that was used to distribute the load down into the ground, kind of like a pyramidal assembly of bricks called typically call it a ziggurat pattern here, that helps spread and disperse the load down into the ground, so you don't get this punching shear going on into the ground, and the framing of the church doesn't do something like that because of differential settlement. And so all these things that we think about today as far as how structure occurs, where we got to get the soil report, and the engineers got to get out there, and we got to make sure we get the information on the computer and run our numbers. They didn't have any of this. Church still standing. So leading to the question, well, were they better builders of structures than we are today? There's an example of the foundation of this church. So you can see this stepping pattern here from the original brick. Stepping down, as you see, they several years earlier had undergone the introduction of concrete here to kind of settle the building, because in this particular case, on one side of the longitudinal elevation, there are cracks that are beginning to form. Portion of the walls begin to pull away from the structure, and they've actually introduced turnbuckles to attempt to bring the wall back in plumb with the rest of the building. So time is beginning to take hold here. These are some details where we have an original detail here with this brick and this brick supporting a solid wood column and another solid wood column, or a steel column here with a plate bolted down into these concrete footers that again help disperse the load into the ground. These are more images here of the columns, of the original columns, and over time things like this lay-in ceiling and some of the things that are necessary today for these churches to function have been introduced. In the tower, you can see the thickness of the wall here. This is an interesting detail because if we look close here, the wall, the opening here actually takes a curve. The brick actually curves all the way up this jam condition here. But you can see how thick this wall here is, and this wall here is, as the brick swings upward into its pointed configuration. And here's a detail of the framework of a portion of the tower, wood framework of the portion of the tower, sliding into openings here to provide support. Some more detailed shots. Now, doing this research here where you've got to walk around and crawl around some sketchy areas here that, okay, I'm going to be a man, I'm not scared. But I'm going to take this step here, and I'm going to take this step here and climb this stairs to get up into this area where I hope my ancestors did their job from a structural standpoint, and I don't fly through the floor. Okay, my thing is, it's still standing, it's still standing, it's still standing. So, that is part of the research here. This is the taller tower where there's a vent here. Now, many of these churches, well, all of these churches, when they were built, did not have air conditioning or things like that. They had operable windows, okay, that allow cross ventilation. You'll see that in just about every one of these churches that had cross ventilation, provided air by simply opening them up, and that's what these folks did. The congregants here told me that they didn't get HVAC systems, heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems introduced into their church until the 1970s. So they were in it for quite a while, and as black folks do with that fan, that fan with the mother and the father and 2 kids on there, that kind of thing. Okay, and on one side, and then Jesus on the other. In the sanctuary, these are original columns. They are solid wood, okay, carved at the capitol and along the corner edges. I mean, these are absolute solid. And above the sanctuary, these roof beams are original to the structure, creating these skylights here that you saw back in the 1908 image. So this is all, except for this finish here, this wood slatted finish, it hasn't changed in over 100 years, except for the obvious introduction of AV systems and lighting and things like that. This church received its historic State of Mississippi historic designation in July of last year, and they were very elated about it. The history of this church was that the contractor, an African-American contractor from Philadelphia, E.J. Allen, was involved in the management and construction of this church. And it's really interesting here that a black man from Philadelphia would come down to Mississippi in the 19th century to help lead the effort to construct this building. We don't know if an architect was involved in the traditional sense, or a design professional was involved in the traditional sense. But what we do know is that, and from what I've discovered in this research, every one of these buildings were built by African Americans. They were actually constructed by African Americans. Whether they were designed by African Americans, that's another question entirely. These next series of slides are not as detailed. I wanted to introduce them because they do establish the consistency, the consistent look from a design standpoint of the Gothic, primarily the Gothic revival. This is Wesley Chapel in Greenwood, Mississippi. We got the tower, strong frontal facade, pointed arches, the masonry buttresses, high arching pitches for the roof. This is the primary facade. And again, this church has not changed from a structural standpoint or from a formal standpoint since it was actually constructed. However, you can see a little bit of patching going on there. You will see a lot of that in a number of these buildings, simply because of the coloration of the brick here versus what is going on right here, or even the primary entrance into the church. Many of these churches either had an aisle that was center to the interior, double loaded with pews on each side, or you entered the doors where the pew was centered about the altar, and then you had side aisles on either the perimeter of the building or side aisles here, and you slide over, and there's another bay of seating, and then another side aisle, and then the perimeter of the building. So there were two different ways to actually move people around the church, but those were the two consistent ways in which the interior church was laid out. And before we move on, we begin to see things like this, the introduction of stained glass. Stained glass would eventually be an element that would begin to introduce the cultural expression that African Americans would ultimately introduce into the design of their buildings. And so it was used to eventually tell stories, biblical stories, stories from a cultural perspective, not unlike the Middle Ages when high Gothic structures in Europe of the Catholic faith had stories that were told through the presence of the stained glass windows. And something else that we see a lot here from a cultural standpoint, a black Jesus. Some of these churches, four of the churches that I've got in this presentation, are Catholic churches. Every last one of them serve African Americans, and from what I've been told by the priests and some members of these churches and their congregations, it is relevant to them to see themselves physically in the church. Okay. And the interesting part about that is when you walk into these churches like this one, this is Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Greenville, Mississippi. Let me get to the interior a little bit later. So on the exterior, the primary element here is more of a Romanesque revival, mainly because we have 180-degree arches that exist in the details of the heads of the windows here and here, even up in the bell tower here, and the windows, not only on the facade, the frontal facade, but on the sides as well. But we still have the presence of, you can see on the edge there, the brick supports. Now, this piece of work, which is stained glass, represents the number of black priests that were educated here. Sacred Heart was established as a school in 1920 to educate African American men who wanted to enter the priesthood. They did that here for 3 years and then moved it to Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, moved the school to Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. It got its origins here. This piece of stained glass, which I took from inside the building, is a historical chronicle of some of the individuals that were in the class of 1920. You can see there 1920 and 1921 as individuals that learned here. So again, we have a layout of an aisle and then a double-loaded condition here. But generally speaking, in the Catholic parishes, you'll see more Eurocentric details here in the Romanesque style with these small details. And the thing here is many of the architectural expressions cannot be expressed from, or usually not expressed from a very pure or very purist perspective. It is an interpretation with specific elements that you will see in the architecture. This church is a state of Mississippi landmark. This is what we're seeing in the rural areas. Okay, this is New Hope Missionary Baptist Church. The challenge, the reality here is that many of the urban churches are faring a little bit better than the rural churches, and this is what we wind up getting here. This was organized and constructed in 1918, and what you can see here as an expression of Carpenter Gothic. Because it is made of wood. We still have the pointed arches, we still have the formal tower, a high-pitched roof, and as we step around the building, consistent detailing here in the foundation of how this building stands. So we've got solid brick, just like we had in the urban churches, and they splay out at the base. Here I was on my tummy, sticking my camera in at the base of this because it couldn't get in. I'm going to go as far as I can. And so you can see the ziggurat detail here, the solid bricks that are standing on top this stair stepping pattern here and here, and the beams, the wood beams that frame not only in each other here, but frame atop the footers as well. This bay area here was actually attached. It was not original to the building, but you can see the state that this thing is in. Skirting is missing here, and the roof is open. It's in really bad shape. But it still has elements here of what once was somewhere in the past, probably some glass there. And at one point in the past, this was actually opened up. As you can see, it was closed up here in this bay. So it is an example of a church type that we are losing in our countrysides, in our rural areas, but it also represents a certain type of building vernacular that we've got to document and keep. Bethel African Methodist Episcopal AME Church. This is in Yazoo City. This church suggests a little bit of Romanesque revival as well, simply because of the details in the tower. And this church, more unlike all the others, was framed with concrete blocks. So these are not bricks that's holding this building up, and you can't. I didn't get close enough to actually take pictures of the specific of the walls, but it is a concrete block framed structure that does the same thing from a structural standpoint as solid masonry walls. The furniture that you see here is all original to this church, and its history goes back to the early part of the 19th century as well. This was I believe, the first AME church in Yazoo City, and one of the first examples of masonry architecture built by African Americans. Same name for a different church in Vicksburg, the AME church in the Bethel AME church in Vicksburg. Again, we have strong tower crenellation, a rose window here. And again, high-pitched roofs and similar details that we're seeing. So we're moving down the river here from the northern portion of the Mississippi, and we'll terminate here in Natchez, seeing the same consistent architectural style applied to these buildings. Heavy wood frame construction on the interior of this structure. And this is a shot from the balcony here. As you can see, again, we have carpet down here and the original wood finish up here. This is also a historic state of Mississippi historic building. Now we're in Natchez, Rose Hill Missionary. We're back to the Gothic revival, so we're back to the pointed arches, but we still have a strong tower, a strong facade, and our buttresses. This is actually more pronounced in detail. But the thing that's really interesting here that I've seen as a consistent element, and I'm going to shoot through this here, is details like that. Okay, that's a downspout on the side of the building. It's located along the sides here and here. So we've got these buttresses coming down. They're structural. But when you start getting close, some smart apple had the good idea to not only roll this downspout in here because it's practical, but to also incorporate it in with the respect of the brick. So the brick actually stops because, from a practical standpoint, this thing's got to work. Also, a historic state of Mississippi historic building. Holy Family Catholic Church, another Gothic revival church. So this time, we have the tower in the center. So all that does is center the details on the primary facade. So as you're walking into the building, you'll see that the aisle in the center of that structure is going to be on axes with the entrance. Just like Jackson Street Missionary Baptist Church, we've got these bays that are being established with brick detail. Same kind of deal. Pointed arches for the windows that are at the sanctuary level, a bit of a watermark right there, and then arched windows at the fellowship level. So as I'm looking at this and seeing these kinds of things, I'm kind of thinking, okay, well, if Church Congregation A designs a Gothic revival building, and then Church Congregation B who wants to build a building looks over here and sees A. Oh, well, that's kind of cool. We're going to go ahead and do that too. And that could have been a reason. I'm still looking to drill down on it. This is the interior of the church. This is again a historic building as well. So now we get down to HBCUs. This church and the next church are located on historically black college campuses. In this case, Tougaloo College. This is Woodward's Chapel. This was originally constructed by the students, which is not unlike what happened at Tuskegee about this time when Booker T. Washington had the students basically build the entire campus, and everything was there for them to do it. This church has gone through a number of major renovations here, including the reconstruction of the tower here. But unlike any of the other churches in the presentation here, this is more of an interpretation of Queen Anne architecture, where the details are a little bit different in that there's more of an atypical layout here instead of a balanced, structured facade. And this church has a very strong history simply because of who was in it and what it supported on that campus. Medgar Evers, Bobby Kennedy, Dr. King, the giants of the movement, as well as, of course, the parishioners, were housed here and planned their resistance here in Mississippi towards segregation. Details you see in this church are, and forgive me for the darkness of the slide here, are original. There's honed wood frame trusses that are here, as you can see a little bit better right here and right here. And Oakland Memorial Chapel at Alcorn State University has an interesting history. This is more Greek revival, or an interpretation of Greek revival. This building is actually the oldest structure on that campus, and it was established in the pre-Civil War era here until the war broke out, and I think it was the Presbyterians, I'm not entirely sure, abandoned the church, was reestablished and taken over by the state of Mississippi, and eventually established as Alcorn State University for the education of the newly freed African Americans. But you see a little touch of column presence here, a little treatment here, the column capitals here and here. So it's an interpretation, I conclude, of a specific style. This wrought iron staircase actually was relocated here from the Windsor mansion, which was located in Claiborne County. So this staircase, wrought iron, was once incorporated in this plantation house. And these are some pretty nice details along the side of this wrought iron structure. So it's a really nice piece of work. Interior structure here, again, the aisle in the center, actually related to the entrance of the building, and then double loaded on each side with, with the pews. And I believe the entire campus is considered a historic place, as the oldest land grant school in the United States. We're back to rural architecture and more endangered structures here. This is Mount Tena, and this is one of those churches where the church history is pretty light. And this is a bit of a challenge here when you're attempting to do research on the rural churches, because a lot of times the congregation either doesn't exist, they've been disbanded, or they have moved somewhere. And this is what happens due to neglect. Same thing that's happening here with Bethel Missionary Church in Shaw, Mississippi. So this is the physicality here with regards to what the challenges are on how to address and ultimately attempt to save, or at least document these buildings. You can't save them all. That's a reality. What I'm trying to do here is to ensure that their history does not get lost to time. And then St. Rosa, this is a Catholic church in Bay St. Louis. Mississippi. It was organized as another parish school in 1868. It was created and in the support of the education of newly freed African Americans. And this is one of those churches where the culture is pretty strong. Again, center aisle, seating on each side. And the unique thing here is that mural that was placed there, I think in the 1980s, 1990s, somewhere around there, when the church undergone some renovation. The idea, and this was moved by the priests at the time, that again the parishioners that the church serves, if it's in a community of culture, ought to look like the culture that it serves. And then finally, St. Joseph Catholic Church, a little touch of Romanesque revival here. This was established somewhere between 1837 and 1910. It's a pretty broad footprint here. Still trying to do a little bit of research on this one as well. But this was, again, another school that was established, a parish that was established for the education of black students. And again, the same kind of layout, interestingly enough, particularly in the ceiling, as we saw in Sacred Heart up in Greenwood. So there's some consistencies that can be drawn from a religious standpoint, depending upon what faith is being supported by the building. So what are the themes here? Gothic revival was an extremely popular architectural style among African Americans buildings in Mississippi, both in rural and urban settings. Construction techniques for building were typically 19th century bearing wall wood frame for floors and roofs. There appeared to be no evidence of an Afrocentric construction influence. In other words, the builders of these buildings built the buildings just like everybody else at the time built buildings. Generally, there was no architect involved, okay, except for the individuals that may have been identified. Now, there are black architects that practiced in the latter part of the 19th century and designed all kinds of buildings for, at that time, a growing middle class of individuals that could support the cost of a new home or a school or, more specifically, a church. All these buildings were built by African Americans, underscoring the relevance of the creation of material culture. Urban churches, as I mentioned before, fared a little bit better than the rural churches, mainly because of abandonment. And all the churches in this presentation, they need work, all of them. So why conduct research on these church buildings? My goal is to exercise and the continuation and identification, research, analysis, and eventual documentation of the historical and cultural aspects of these buildings. This is something here that people will ask, well, what's the relevance? Well, the relevance here is that a group of enslaved people at the end of the Civil War were able to establish a home for themselves. They constructed these buildings to become the centers of their communities and the centers of their lives. That is part of value and relevance here towards the existence of these churches. The gathering of documented evidence to support historical designation of a church building, which we saw in many of the examples here, which may also open up in identifying building and the congregants to the opportunities of funding for renovation. Many of the churches that I've researched in my travels are in that same position. You'll see watermarks in the ceilings or the facades being pulled away from their structure. They need a lot of work. We connect the congregants to a network of organizations with a shared interest in the preservation of Afrocentric material culture. Providing the opportunity for congregants and supporters of the church to share their story with the general public via accessibility to mainstream literary venues, as well as scholarly presence through publications, academic conferences, presentations, and chit-chats like this. The continued development of an African American church database of information, which I've actually got started. I've got over 100 churches identified throughout the South that fall within a time period here. In this case, the database is a little bit tighter, between 1880 and 1920. Every one of these churches that's in the database was constructed by African Americans, and many of them were designed by African American architects. So this living document, at least that's what I'm calling it, is something that I want to get up and be used as a point of accessibility for anyone who wants to find out a little bit more about these structures. and to expand architectural history discourse in colleges and university curriculums, as well as African American history studies, to include the teaching of these buildings as well as African American architects. In other words, I'm trying to put another chair to the table. Okay, in our architectural education, we learn about the Greeks, we learn about the Romans, we even learn a little bit about the Egyptians before we cross the Mediterranean to Greece. Okay, it is a Eurocentric form of education, which is obviously necessary, but there are all the different diverse cultures around the world. And a class that I teach at Mississippi State, which is the history class that spans from the late 18th century to today, introduces not only African Americans in architecture in the 19th century, but women. This is part of academic discourse that needs to be part of the telling the education of our architectural history. So I want to leave you guys with a quote from Mississippian Richard Wright. For it is only when we are within the walls of our churches that we are wholly ourselves, that we keep alive a sense of our personalities in relation to the total world in which we live, that we maintain a quiet and constant communion with all that is deepest in us. This is his description of what these buildings mean to African Americans. Thank you very much. Now, I don't know what time it is. I hope I didn't go too crazy with it, but if there are questions, we'd be happy to answer them. I don't know whether Mike, he has the mic.
For a couple.
Wonderful presentation.
Thank
I'm
you.
from Wayne County, where it was a strong slavery presence as well. And my community, which is Pleasant Grove, was founded in 1867, and I saw almost identical a picture of what the church is Pleasant Grove Missionary Baptist Church. I think you referred to the structure as Gothic carpentry.
Gothic carpenter, a wood frame building.
And it was one picture that survived. And it's just amazing, like you said, with our history and with this building. And I was told that it was a bell that existed. I don't know, was it the tower, and it was a place of communication, of like communication to the communities. Did you see bells in these towers that still existed?
I wrote my thesis on the first African Baptist church located in Savannah, Georgia. That building was built in the mid-1850s, and it was an interesting history considering that was in the antebellum South prior to the Civil War. But when a tower was placed on that building in the 1870-ish, that kind of thing, the bell was forged from a bell foundry in Philadelphia, and shipped down to Savannah, and it made news. That's how I found out about it. The newspaper actually wrote about the bell coming down on a barge from Philadelphia to be installed in First African. And then a week later, when it arrived, they wrote another article saying the bell has arrived. And they, I mean, it was fascinating. This is newspapers in the 1880s writing about this stuff. The towers likely had a bell of some kind. Some of the conditions I was not able to identify because I wasn't able to do a full-blown field work on these buildings. But that was the consistent theme here in the presence and construction of these buildings across the South.
It was a very interesting presentation, maybe the best one I've heard in a long time.
Thank you.
Anyway, there's a modern trend I've seen in a few black churches where the architecture incorporates some themes they think relate back to Africa. And I wonder if you'd comment on that phenomenon. Of course, I realize you're interested in the past, but the present and the future seems to occasionally dip back into the far past.
Well, no, I'm very interested in the present as well. One of the big moves here from a construction standpoint today is the presence of mega churches that are being built. I mean, today, like I mentioned before, this is the only institution that African Americans primarily control. So you pass that collection plate, we've got this building committee going on, we're going to raise some money, we're going to build the annex here, and it's going to have a basketball arena in it, and we're going to charge and have tournaments and raise more money, and eventually we get to the mega church. Okay, so there are no issues with regard from the past with regards to what you can do. Yeah, I find it interesting that, and this is my own, I'll say subjective perspective here, I find it interesting that when you are now in a situation as African Americans to express yourselves in the design and construction of these churches, in many of these cases, it doesn't happen. Okay, to be more specific, many of these mega churches have sanctuaries that don't have windows. And there's a spiritual and natural connection from an Afrocentric, and I think from a spiritual perspective as well. How can you see God? How can you experience God on Sunday morning if you can't, if there's no window to at least receive the light? It's man-made. It's just like this. Okay, so certain things like the prayer dancers, praise dancers, and things like that do have an architectural influence where the elevated altar is here and the first row of pews are here. We need some space, enough space here for the praise dancers to come down the aisle and do their thing, or the choir that may come down the aisle and do their thing. Those are architectural and programmatic influences here that have a direct influence on how the interior of the church is designed. But from my perspective today, and it's a point of debate, you have the opportunity to express yourself and you don't do it. That is what I'm generally seeing. Not only do I see that, but again, are we, through our mega church presence here, designing the structure that is disconnected from the Creator? So that can be an architectural point of debate.
I love it when we have more questions than we have time for. I'm not at all surprised that that's the case today after this fabulous program. I talked with Dr. Hunter before, though, and he is happy to answer any questions that you may have following the program. Thank you all for being here today. I hope that we see you this evening for the country music program and next week. But help me now thank Chris Hunter for this fabulous program.
Thank you. Thank you very much.